Hello, my name is Sandy Adomaitis, the social media director for the Page International Screenwriting Awards, and your host for the Writers Hangout, a podcast that celebrates the many stages of writing, from inspiration to the first draft, revising, getting a project made, and everything in between. We'll talk to the best and the brightest in the entertainment industry and create a space where you can hang out, learn from the pros, and have fun.
Hi, I'm Sandy Adomaitis.
And I'm Terry Sampson.
How's your day been so far, Terry?
It's been great. And yourself?
Absolutely wonderful. I enjoyed the little bit of rain we got last night.
You know, it's so rare to have rain here. It's kind of a special event.
Yes, I really liked it. I am going to tell you and the audience the story of Paul Bern. Do you recognize the name Paul Bern?
No.
Okay. Very, very, very interesting man. Paul Bern was born on December 3rd, 1889 in Wandsbek, which is near Hamburg in northern Germany, near the North Sea. He was one of 6 children of Julius and Henrietta Levy. Julius worked as a clerk for a shipping company before he opened up a candy store. I would have loved to have my dad own a candy store.
Oh, it's a dream.
Yes. In 1898, Julius decided to move the family to the United States due to the rise of unemployment and anti-Jewish attitudes in Wandsbek. The family eventually settled in New York City. According to the author E.J. Fleming, who wrote a book about Paul, the Levys enjoyed a middle-class life, and in September in 1909, Paul auditioned for the prestigious American Academy of Dramatic Arts, along with about 40 other students, and he got in. The Academy, I would say in 1909 to 1910, the tuition was $400. Now, that's not an insignificant amount when a car cost about $750 at the time. And guess how much a house probably cost back then?
I'm going to say $1,000.
Very close. About $3,000 for, say, in New York City, a 7-bedroom house.
Wow.
Yes. While he was at the Academy, Paul adopted the stage name Paul Bern. It's not a big change, right? Paul, from Paul Levy to Paul Bern.
It's a huge change.
Do you think?
Yeah.
Oh.
Bern?
Bern? Yeah, I guess I thought maybe a longer, more fancy name. I'm not sure.
What would you have gone with for Paul?
Paul Rockstar.
Oh, perfect.
Perfect.
Boy, where were you for that guy?
Yeah, I know.
Man.
Okay, after graduating, Paul became a stage manager at the Academy, and in the summer of 1912, he joined the newly formed Annie Russell Old English Comedy Company, led by one of the best-known actresses of early 1900s, Annie Russell. The company was known for faithful depictions of everything from period speech to costumes. After engagements in Connecticut, Providence, Rhode Island, and Boston, Russell grew weary of travel and in early 1914 disbanded the troupe. I can't think of anything more wonderful than putting on plays up and down the East Coast back then. It must have been, so, Mickey Rooney, come on, kids, let's put on a show.
Yeah, it must have been great. And there's a lot of pressure when you have the word comedy in the title of your... Because you really need to deliver.
And it wasn't only comedy, it was Old English.
Yeah.
Yes.
With the OLD.
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Paul returned to New York with the skills of an actor, writer, stage manager, and director. In September, Paul was hired to direct a play entitled The Guilty Man. All right, during this time, studios were popping up all over New York. In 1910, movie companies were small operations. But by 1913, the demand for movies meant the industry had to expand. There was also a move underway to making longer films. Because Paul could write, he was hired to produce scenarios at a studio in Toronto, Canada. In April 1918, United Pictures Theaters of America, Inc. was created and attracted popular stars and respected technical people and writers like Paul. Paul came to be known as a writer who dealt with feuding families. Paul's The North Wind's Malice is about feuding brothers, with one coming between the other among business entanglements. Suspicious Wives is about a couple separated over family arguments who end up together at her hideaway farm. And Greater Than Love, which is about a couple that separates due to family issues and winds up in the faraway house where the wife has been hidden. Although organized scenario departments first appeared in 1915, writers were just beginning to come to the forefront and often not credited. Until then, plays and books were purchased because producers didn't think writers used to writing 8 to 20-minute scripts could create stories an hour long. How rude. United was one of the first studios to assemble Hollywood's first story department. That's pretty cool. In the late summer of 1920, Paul joined Goldwyn Pictures, which was located in Los Angeles, and he directed his first major feature. That's really interesting that writers were allowed to be directors back then. You could make the switch.
It makes perfect sense, especially if they're hiring themselves.
Yes, they know the material.
Yeah, that's great.
Paul should have been on top of the world, but at the same time, his mother, Henrietta's body was discovered off of Rockaway Beach in the early morning of September 15th. Yeah, that's tragic. Okay, according to author E.J. Fleming, Paul moved into the Crawford Apartments at 941 Georgia Street. That was a neighborhood southwest of downtown L.A. It was about a mile west of Goldwyn. I guess back in the day, East L.A., I think is where the studios started in Edendale, which is a part of Silver Lake now.
Wow.
So that makes sense that he was probably southwest of downtown LA.
Yeah, and the artsy people just stayed there.
They did.
Mm-hmm.
The Crawford was a 3-story wooden building with 29 apartments. It wasn't fancy. The apartments rented for, okay, we'll do the guessing game again. What do you think the apartments possibly rented for?
They had to have 10 a week.
You're pretty good at this. 10 to 30 a month.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's a good deal.
Kind of works out. 40,
Yeah.
You were saying 40. No 1920 era structures remain in that part of the Georgia Street. They've been replaced by the parking lots serving Staples Center. Oh, but that kind of gives you an idea where that was. That was kind of off Olympic, I would say.
Imagine if I was still paying the $10.
I know.
It's a great place.
I actually have a rent-controlled apartment, and I do pay $10 a month, so do not be jealous.
Wow.
Okay. Paul then co-directed, I know you're going to know this name, Paul then co-directed the Mabel Normand film Head Over Heels. The daughter of a Staten Island carpenter, Mabel lived a completely reckless life and was known as Hollywood's I don't care girl. Larger than life. I know, wouldn't you? I would like that nickname. Larger than life, the queen of comedy was barely 5 feet tall and 95 pounds. Mabel and Paul became and stayed very close friends till Mabel's tragic death in 1930s.
She probably cared then, but keep going. Yeah, so.
Paul quickly developed a wide circle of friends, from actors and cameramen to writers and studio executives in Los Angeles. His closest friend was Carrie Wilson, a 30-year-old Philadelphia-born writer who invited Paul to share his house on Kings Road in the hills above Sunset Boulevard. Paul moved in, but he kept his Georgia Street apartment. Kings Road became the most notorious bachelor hangout in Hollywood. I've always liked Kings Road. I'm not quite sure why.
Yeah, I agree.
It was a nice street.
And really, it's still kind of
it's a cool street.
Place, yeah.
I actually have a friend who lives on Kings Road. Okay.
We'll do a show from his place.
Yes. Paul continued a rapid ascent at Goldwyn and began to be chronicled in papers and magazines. Paul never told writers what kind of stories he wanted because he said that led them to produce what they thought the studios wanted. Very smart. He said Goldwyn would make really big pictures, but no light comedies. Nothing designed for a specific star, which worked out because Goldwyn had very few of those, and no costume stories or westerns. In short, nothing expensive. Paul suggested a need for being inventive from writers who recognized the fundamental human relationships that resulted in terrific dramatic clashes, but he warned that drama should never lead to heaviness or morbidity that loses the viewer's interest. Interesting. Paul also said stories should be written as an original effort expressed in picture terms and born of a picture mind. No formula can be written to express how to appeal to the audience, for any formula would merely act in limiting repressive manner and would defeat our purpose of trying to secure fresh, untrammeled novel stories, idea, and twists. All right, okay, this I find so interesting. Paul was leading a change in writing style for movies, opining that scenarios should be created expressly in the language of the screen, that the new sort of writer must be born to satisfy the demands of the screen. He knew movie writers had to be developed. They weren't born, and studios needed a school of writers who would throw away completely the idea of writing novels and write screen material purely. I guess thus the screenwriter is born.
There it is.
There it is. Paul believed moviegoers went to the theaters to purchase the riddle of the universe and solve all the problems that afflict mankind by escaping from them. Story development was one of Paul's strengths. He believed a great scenario could be developed from a single good idea, that a great plot could be built around a single situation or character. In late 1928, Paul began building a home for himself in Benedict Canyon. He paid $15,000 for a 3-acre property in Benedict Canyon at the top of winding Easton Drive and started construction on a Bavarian-style lodge.
That sounds great.
Yeah. Now, a side note on this, and this kind of blew my mind a little. In 1963, the house was sold to celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring, who a year later began dating an aspiring actress, Sharon Tate.
Ooh.
Yes, that, as we all know, is Jay and Sharon died at the hands of Manson. Very, very eerie. In 1930, Paul met the actress Jean Harlow shortly before the premiere of her first major role in Howard Hughes's Hell's Angels. Jean was known for her portrayal of bad girl characters. She was the leading sex symbol of the early 1930s and one of the defining figures of the pre-code era of American cinema, and was nicknamed the Blonde Bombshell. Actually, everybody seemed to have a nickname back then. Paul had the nickname of Hollywood's Father Confessor because he was known to just listen to people and take on their problems and try to solve them. Not many thought very much of Jean's acting, but Paul did. After they began seeing each other, Paul talked Louis B. Mayer to buy out Jean's contract with Howard Hughes and sign her to MGM. On Jean's 21st birthday, MGM purchased her contract, and Harlow officially joined the studio on April 20th, 1932.
21, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
I had my first drink at 21. I did not get a contract at MGM Studio.
That's a shame.
But boy, did that slow gin fizz taste good.
It was delicious.
Delicious. After dating for a while, one evening, Paul took Jean from some dancing at the Cotton Club and then back to Easton, his home in Benedict Canyon. Paul later told friends, "I was sitting in the living room and Jean was sitting on my lap. I said to her, 'Jean, we can't go on like this much longer.' She said, 'What do you mean?' I asked, 'Do you think you'll ever marry me?' Jean replied, 'Do you want me to?' I said, 'You know I do.' And she said, 'Yes, then.'"
Wow.
Sweet. On July 2nd, 1932, Paul and Jean married. Paul was Jean's senior by 22 years. As a wedding present, Paul gave Jean Easton. 2 months later, on Labor Day weekend, after working at MGM on a Sunday, Jean stopped at Easton to see Paul before going to spend the night at her home on Clubview Drive. Jean lived at Clubview before marrying Paul, and her mother and husband still lived there. Jean's mother's husband was away for the weekend, and Jean's mother wanted company. That Monday, September 5th, 1932, was a sunny and warm Labor Day when Winifred and John Carmichael, Paul's cook and butler, who also worked for MGM, arrived at Easton to start their day. John let himself into the master bedroom. He thought the house seemed terribly quiet. I tiptoed into his room. It was empty. Then I stepped into the dressing alcove to turn up the blind and stumbled over his body. Paul was lying naked, crumpled in a heap on the floor, facing the wall outside his dressing room. Part of the side of his head was missing, and his hair was soaked and matted with dried blood. Large blood stains and bits of brain dotted the wall and ceiling. There was a hole in the wall near the ceiling. One of Paul's 2 guns was in the middle of the floor, perhaps 12 feet from the body. Winifred called Jean's mother and told her Paul was dead. You'd think she'd call the police? It was a different time. Without telling her daughter, Jean's mother then called Louis B. Mayer. Again, police are not called.
Oh, my God.
Who in turn called the studio police chief and publicity director. They gathered a crew to keep whatever happened at Paul's house quiet and contained. Mayer then dressed and left for Easton, telling his wife to call Irving Thalberg. When all the studio men arrived at Eaton, none of them knew exactly what happened, but it is alleged that they thought it would look better if Paul had died by suicide instead of rumors about Jean starting up and hurting her career. So they went about to stage the scene. They turned Paul around to face the other way from the wall, and they wiped the gun clean of fingerprints. One of them tried to place it in Paul's right hand, but his body was in advanced rigor mortis and the arm was tucked under his chest. So they kind of awkwardly just jammed it into his palm. And I guess when you see photos, which I'm going to put on the Instagram for the Writers Hangout, you can see that the gun is awkwardly in his palm.
And would not look like he fell on it kind of thing.
Right.
Okay.
They wanted a suicide note, and they found a note that read, "Dearest dear, unfortunately, this is the only way to make good the frightful wrong I have done you and wipe out my abject humiliation. I love you, Paul. You understand that last night was only a comedy." The note was placed in the bedroom. Hours later, the police were finally called. I guess that note was found in a book by the front door, kind of like a guest book, and it just happened to fit, they felt. All Paul's secrets died with him, but there are 3 theories of who could have possibly killed Paul Bern. I'm going to go through those now. Theory number 1, love American style. Paul's death was by the hand of his previous common-law wife, Dorothy Millette. The two had met in Toronto, and their relationship began around 1911. Very little is known about Dorothy's background, but the pair lived together in New York City until Dorothy was overcome with mental illness. In the early 1920s, before Paul left for California, Paul committed Dorothy to the Blythewood Sanitarium in Greenwich, Connecticut, a few hours from the city by car. This was the top sanitarium of its kind in the country. Paul described Dorothy as breathtaking, enchanting, indescribable, the loveliest girl I've ever seen. Dorothy was eventually released from Blythewood. She moved to the Algonquin Hotel in New York, an apartment paid for by Paul. Paul took care of her for the rest of her life. It was understood she would stay in New York and would get on with her life, and he would continue on with his. When Paul married Jean Harlow, it is said that Dorothy became obsessed with the couple and barraged them with letters and phone calls. Dorothy traveled to Los Angeles in September 1932, where she reportedly visited Paul on the night of his death. In fact, Paul's housekeeper says she found a bathing suit at Eton the Monday of Paul's death that did not belong to Jean. At the time, Dorothy was spending time in San Francisco, so she could have come down, I guess. Later, it was determined that Dorothy died by suicide by jumping from the Delta King steamboat. Her body was found in the Sacramento River 2 days after Paul's death. Theory number 2, Gone Girl. Jean Harlow murdered her husband. Gossip magazines and rumors began to spread that Paul used to beat up Jean Harlow, and in a rage, she shot him. The rumors also got conflated with the stories the MGM executives began to spread to protect Jean's career. Paul was declared impotent and was spiraling into depression and anger because he couldn't satisfy his young wife. The Suits felt it was better for Joan to have a husband who died by suicide than being killed by someone else, including a ghost wife named Dorothy. Theory number 3, Swimming with Sharks. Studio insiders considered Paul's secretary, Irene Harrison, a suspect. Mousy, but not unattractive, Irene worked for Paul for 6 years and was said to be in love with him. They were even rumored to have had an affair. Born in England, she immigrated with her parents and younger brother in 1911 and was 23 when Paul hired her. She lived at a bungalow on 4194 Lafayette Avenue with her parents and her 22-year-old brother, whom Paul hired as a film editor. Irene was inconsolable during the weeks after he died. The saddest figure on the lot, who bravely tried to fight back tears, but it was impossible. I just can't believe it, she was heard to say over and over. Terry, what do you think happened to Paul Bern?
Well, I'm going to start by saying that, in theory, Paul Bern was the last person to ever say to a woman, "This has got to stop now." Nobody says that. No guy has ever said it. We stopped that in 1963. Was that the year? That was the last year anybody said, a guy ever said that. They would say to her, "No, this will work out fine." And she would say that.
Yes.
That's my first take on it. But in the story, I sort of like the first one.
Dorothy.
Dorothy.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, she had a history of mental illness.
Correct.
And then apparently plane flight was available. That gets you across the United States.
Yes. And she was in San Francisco at the time, and Paul was actually even paying for her hotel up there. She wrote him a letter saying, I'm, thinking of vacay up there. And he said, great. Basically, you can put it on my dime.
Do we know that she was bothered with the marriage?
Paul did confide in some people. And people, good friends of Paul even said that Jean Harlow knew of Dorothy. In fact, that's the reason why Dorothy, there's a scenario out there where they felt that because she was sending them so many letters and calling them, it was time to really put a stop to this. So Paul was going to have a talk with her. She came down from San Francisco. Jean went to stay with her mother because Jean didn't want to be there for that conversation. And maybe they had a swim, maybe they had a nice talk, but then she became enraged. And when Paul was changing, she picked up a gun and shot him. I mean, that is all very, very possible. So there's some records in the studio where a car came to pick up her Labor Day morning to take her back to San Francisco. So there is that record. I didn't see any proof of it, but there was rumors of it. So It's a possibility. It's a very strong possibility.
I like that one. The second one with Jean Harlow, no. You get signed MGM, you're in a sweet spot.
Happy.
You're not killing anybody either.
They really did seem to be in love. I mean, also the gossip magazines like to say, oh, she was just a sex symbol and Paul was just an average looking man. But he was so smart and so accomplished, and he seemed to adore her.
It's all about jingling the bell, right? I mean, you really don't have to do anything except make each other happy. And
yes.
That's how that works. So
yes.
I'm on board with that. The third one with the secretary, I'm not buying that either. They have a thankless job, but, there's no point in killing the boss.
Yeah, no. She had to go back into the secretarial pool, I'm sure.
See?
It's not a good place to be.
Then who knows where you're going.
The resources for my story are a book entitled Paul Bern, The Life and Famous Death of the MGM Director and Husband of Harlow, Wikipedia, an article by Katie Dowd of the San Francisco Gate, and a House Beautiful article by Alyssa Florentino. That's where I got the information about the house once being owned by J. Sebring, and I think also the same area is where the Manson murders took place. There was also a gossip magazine wrote up a story that while Jean was at Eton, she had a dream where she was tied up at the banister and murdered, or there was a ghost at the banister, and that's, tragically what happened to Sharon Tate. I don't believe that rumor. I think that was totally made up, but I guess it sold magazines at the time.
Yeah, people have dreams that they have bamboos. They have, feet made of bamboo. It's,
yeah.
You can't go with dreams.
So do you want to talk about anything, Terry? Do you have a terrible reoccurring bamboo nightmare?
Is that where we're going with it?
Yeah.
I'm famous, not famous, I want to say. I'm one of these people that had the I'm going to school in my underwear dream a lot. Yeah, I had a lot.
Yes.
To the point where I got better underwear. I felt that was the best.
That's right.
If you're going, if you're going, look nice.
I always have you haven't gone to school all semester and now you have to take the exam. And I find myself roaming the halls looking for the class because I don't even know where it is. So it terrifies me every single time.
Sadly, that sounds a lot like my college career. So I lived that one, I must say.
Yes. And all joking aside, if you are struggling and have thoughts of suicide, there's help available 24/7. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 800-273-8255. And that is the story of the Hollywood father confessor and the blonde bombshell. That's a wrap for the Writers Hangout. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, like, and thrive. Till we get to hang out again, keep writing. The world needs your stories. The Writers Hangout is sponsored by the Page International Screenwriting Awards. Executive producer, Kristin Overn. Producers, Terry Sampson and Sandy Adomaitis. Music by Ethan Stoller.